After much speculation about his political future, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced he would be stepping down eventually. Despite some wanting a winter election, Trudeau announced he would be staying on until a new Liberal leader was chosen and that Parliament would be put on hold until late March. I'm Dave Breckenridge and this is 10-3. Edmonton Journal columnist David Staples and Edmonton Sun columnist Lorne Gunter join me to discuss the factors that likely led to Trudeau's departure, how his legacy will be viewed in Western Canada, and whether there's a potential successor who could turn Liberal fortunes around. Don't forget, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, as we all know, as we all saw on Monday, on January 6th, Justin Trudeau came out of Rideau College and basically said to Canadians and assembled media who were there, "I'm done. I'm resigning as Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Party." However, it was not an immediate stepping down. Talk of this has been brewing for a while, and I guess that's where I wanted to start. I'll start with you, Lorne. Heading into Monday, as talk started to swirl that the Prime Minister was going to step down, that we were going to hit Monday, he was going to resign, were you anticipating that it was going to be, all right, I'm done, or I've asked the Governor General to dissolve Parliament, or we're going to have an election? What were you anticipating heading into Monday's announcement?
Exactly what happened, because there were reports out of Ottawa, rumors and reports out of Ottawa that he was going to announce a resignation, but he wasn't going to give a specific date. There was some speculation that he wanted to hang on until at least June so he could host the G7, which will be in Kananaskis this year. So, it's a typical narcissist's behavior. I will tell you I'm leaving, but I am still in total control, and I'm not going to tell you when, so I'm going to keep you guessing. He did pretty much what I expected him to do.
David, are you looking at the same low bar there? Did you have the same low expectations heading into Monday, or were you hopeful that he might have decided, right, see you suckers, I'm out of here?
I have to, I think my bar was lower. I think that there were reports, the Globe and Mail the day before had reported that he was going to resign before Wednesday. So I put a lot of weight in that. Their reporting has been credible on what Trudeau's up to. So, but I've always, just until you hear it, it's kind of expect the unexpected. And I say my bar was lower because I thought his self-belief, I'll put it that way kindly, was so great that he might decide to run and call an election and just power ahead through everything, through all objection, because the Liberal Party doesn't seem to have a mechanism to get rid of him. And if he wanted to do that and felt like convinced himself that he had some kind of opportunity or chance, I put like a 20% chance that he might try that, running again.
Yeah. David, for your part, what did you make of his speech? What were your thoughts on what he had to say for himself? I've always been a fighter, and, I get the sense he was trying to put a nice spin on his time in office.
He didn't say much. He didn't go over a list of his accomplishments as Prime Minister, a long list, which I thought he might have done. He didn't thank anyone for his time in office. It was very kind of, it had a little bit of a peevish air to it. And the thing that I found kind of, I couldn't agree with at all was his claim that he does what's in the best interest for Canadians. He talks about a fighter, but best interest Canadians got to do what you want is, you guys want, he tells us, a strong Liberal option in the next election. And yes, some, 10% of Canadians probably have that high on their list. But I think most Canadians right now are very concerned about the Trump tariffs, about these negotiations. And what we need is a strong Prime Minister with a fresh mandate who doesn't make the hair stand on end of Trump Republicans like Trudeau does. The level of mockery and contempt for Trudeau among American Republicans is off the charts. And to have him leading these negotiations is a disaster for Canada. So what we need is someone else, someone who's been freshly elected. What we need is an election. So for him to, and Trudeau's done this all of throughout his term, is he speaks for Canadians. He tells us what we think, what our values are, and for about half of us, it just falls flat. Now, I think it's closer to 80% with this speech where it falls flat. People want an election. We need one, and he's not giving it to us.
Lorne, what about for you when you were watching the Prime Minister? Did it fall as flat for you as it did for David?
Well, yeah, I think it had a more visceral effect on me than it did on David. But the thing that struck me most was, again, and I want to bring up the term narcissism again, it was the narcissism of the whole thing. So he goes to the Governor General and asks for prorogation. Parliament is now suspended. The previous session is ended. All of the legislation that was pending is now defunct. And that is not an attempt by him to stave off an election call. That's because the opposition was being so mean to the Liberals and demanding the documents from the Green Slush Fund. And they can't have those, so we need to have prorogation to stop all of this. No, it's not. There's nothing about that, except they wanted to avoid having a non-confidence motion as soon as Parliament came back on the 27th of January. And then he says, well, I could stay on and fight. I'm a fighter. I could have stayed on and fought in another election, but all this internal infighting in the Liberal Party just makes it not possible for me to be the standard bearer. So it's not his fault that he can't be the standard bearer. It's all those people in his party who are bickering that have caused this. And, and I think we would have less divisive politics in this country if the opposition had only gone in favor of democratic reforms back in 2016. He had a majority. Mm-hmm. Like he said, but the opposition, I couldn't have brought in those reforms because the opposition didn't like them. He had a majority, for crying out loud. I mean, so everything he did in his speech on Monday was blame someone else or at least deflect the blame from himself. He is a textbook narcissist. And as a result of it, David correctly points out that we are stuck with him for however long it takes the Liberals to elect a new leader. We're stuck with him during one of the most critical economic times in recent Canadian history. And that's all because of his narcissism.
Looking at the past year, we've had, by-election losses that were seen as a bellwether of how bad things were for the Liberals. We've had people leaving cabinet. We had the bombshell cabinet departure of Chrystia Freeland in late December, and really plummeting polling numbers. Lorne, was there anything that you feel were main factors in his departure, or perhaps a final straw that convinced him, I guess it's time. I guess I have to step away. I may be a fighter, but it's time for me to go.
Well, I'd like to credit that lady in the parking lot at the ski slope in BC who told him to get the F out of British Columbia for waking him up. But no, I think what happened. So first of all, the Atlantic Liberal Caucus voted no confidence in him. Then the Ontario Liberal Caucus didn't actually hold a vote, but most of them signed a letter saying they thought it was better if he left. And then Quebec Caucus started making noises that he should go. And there really aren't many other Liberal caucuses. There isn't a Liberal Prairie Caucus. There's only 6 Liberals in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And I think there are 13 left in BC, but the current polls suggest they'll be down to 1 or 2 seats in BC. So I think he and people like Gerald Butts, his longtime friend and advisor, were able to hunker down and say, hey, look, this just isn't going to work. There is no way out of this. And even he had to accept that.
Yeah. And David, for you, was it circumstances in the past year? Was it a culmination of things over a number of years? What do you suppose added up to the decision that it is time for an exit?
Well, I think Lorne did a good job of summarizing the political field there. There was 2 issues, I think, that really drove the Canadian public to turn against Trudeau. Trudeau's leaving because he has such low support, and everyone notices it now, even if Trudeau maybe doesn't. His entire party notices it. Chrystia Freeland, anyone with ambitions to lead the party notices it. So he's driven out by his own party, who are driven by two issues, I think: inflation and immigration. Inflation's been hitting us for the last 3 or 4 years. And, for most Canadians, it's an absolutely terrible factor in their lives. Everyone's gone through the budget, subtracted multiple things, put off multiple things. And then there's the people worse off, that are just cutting some luxuries or extra things. They're just, they're eating less, and they're having a hard time finding a place to live that they can afford. So inflation is grinding people down. And then the immigration, which is just out of control by most people's standards, I think. There's a fear of how many people we're letting in and what kind of people that we're letting in, whether we're letting in people that don't share Canadian values, who in fact hate Canada, and, has been chanted at some recent rallies in Canada, death to Canada. So I think those things are hugely troubling to most Canadians. And I think those are the fundamental drivers in politics. They're not political scandals, which Trudeau had endless political scandals. It's these really checkbook issues and neighborhood issues coming home to all of us, and a huge amount of anxiety around them.
We'll be right back. Now, all of us on this podcast episode today, we're all sitting out in Alberta in Western Canada. And one thing that I know is, and I think a lot of people know, is Justin Trudeau very unpopular here. He's one of the few prime ministers I can recall who could rile up both Jason Kenney and Rachel Notley over some of his energy policies. David, how do you feel Trudeau will be remembered out west? What will be his legacy for Western Canada?
He will be seen by far as the worst Canadian prime minister in history. And it's not close, which is saying a lot because his father was so hated here. But his father at least had the respect of being an intellectual, extremely smart. I talked to Peter Lougheed once about Pierre Trudeau, and he mentioned just how he didn't know anything about petrochemicals when Lougheed first brought it up. 6 weeks later, he talks to Pierre Trudeau. Pierre Trudeau has mastered the file. Justin Trudeau never mastered any file once. But what he did was relentlessly push to crush the Alberta oil and gas industry in a discriminatory fashion. And he did it in a as if the whole weight of world climate change was Alberta's fault, was one industry's fault, as opposed to everyone who uses oil and gas in the world and all the other countries that produce oil and gas. He had a maniacal obsession with crushing this huge industry for Canada. And, one of the most environmentally sound oil and gas industries in the world, and in a democratic country. And he ceded the entire field to dictator oil. He will be remembered for Bill C-48, which means we can't ship one specific type of oil from Alberta off the west coast, for C-69, which has eliminated all in outside investment in major industrial projects in Canada because of his red tape. And he'll be remembered for calling plastics toxic, which they're not, calling carbon dioxide pollution, which it isn't. And all the madness of his climate change alarm and obsession coming down on one province will not be forgotten in Alberta, and has radicalized many Albertans against him and his party.
Mm-hmm. Lorne, is it the same for you? Do we look at his energy policy, some of his cabinet ministers' climate fanaticism, and say that's it, that's his legacy here out west?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and even the one energy issue that they tried to take some credit for, and probably deserve some credit for, which was Trans Mountain, when it was critically before the courts for the approval process, the Trudeau government had its Justice Department lawyers throw the case and not argue the federal position in favor of building the pipeline. And it was only because the Alberta government and the Saskatchewan government and a couple of other legal entities made convincing arguments to the court that it actually went ahead. And so, yeah, I mean, we were their scapegoat for everything. We were the whipping boy of Confederation because they knew they could get votes in downtown Toronto and in Montreal and in Ottawa and in some cases in Vancouver for beating up on Alberta and Alberta's number one industry. So I think that's it. But I think there's a growth industry coming out of this resignation, and that is, I think I might set up a company to remove the F Trudeau decals from the back of half the pickup trucks in Alberta. I think there's a lot of money to be made.
I think they'll still wear those things proudly even after he goes. Yeah, I mean, there's looking at the last almost 10 years of the Trudeau government. There are a lot of things for which he'll be criticized. I know there was mention of past scandals. There was the blackface, brownface scandal. There was the India trip. There was his treatment of some of his cabinet ministers and caucus members, the carbon tax. There's a lot of things that he's going to be remembered not so fondly for. Is there something that you can point to that you feel that he did during his time as prime minister that was good for the country? The joke here would be that he's leaving, and I don't mean that. I mean, Lorne, you did talk about Trans Mountain, although there were some troubles with getting it to the finish line. Some people might look at the legalization of cannabis as being a positive economically, and I think for the criminal justice system as well, you're not penalizing people for doing something that has borne out that it's not harmful in a lot of ways. It's not the harm that I think some people made it out to be, especially once you take it out of the hands of the black market. So with some of those things in mind, Lorne, is there something that you can point to that say, yes, I can admit this is a good thing that Justin Trudeau did while he was Prime Minister of Canada?
No. I mean, to be very frank, you asked us this morning to put our minds to this before we started recording, and I puzzled for quite a while, and I couldn't come up with it. I mean, the cannabis legalization was good, but I never imagined when they started talking about that almost 10 years ago that they meant the government would control it. I mean, they thought, okay, well, Sam down at your local bar is still going to sell you dope. He won't go to jail, but he wasn't going to jail before that. Because you remember there was a Supreme Court decision about 10 years before legalization that basically took all the teeth out of enforcement of black market marijuana. And so all the Anne McClellan Commission did was say, okay, well, we're going to take it away from all of these entrepreneurs in your neighborhood and give it to regulatory boards in all the provinces. And I think that one of the reasons why the legal market for cannabis has not been as big as people expected it to be, and why the black market still exists in quantity, because their instinct was to make the government the regulator of it. And so, yeah, I mean, you could say that. He got some kudos today from Joe Biden. So lefty American presidents who haven't got all their mental faculties think he was really great for the world. There's a positive, I guess. But that's about it.
David, what about for you? Anything that you can point to that you might say, like, yeah, either I was wrong about this, or maybe it's not as bad as I thought it was, or that this is like a neutral good?
Well, I can't. I think he was a disaster for Canada, Lorne. I think what's known as his woke agenda is a disaster. In the end, it's an extremist agenda that is a disaster for Canada, and his economics are even worse. But I do know a lot of people, including in my own family, who really like Justin Trudeau. And so I can tell you what other people like, and I can give him credit for this. There was a lot of groups in Canada, LGTB plus, some immigrant groups. As COVID came along, there was a huge group of people extremely anxious about COVID, fearful out of their minds. And Trudeau was their champion. He made, there was also hardcore drug users. Trudeau was a champion for some people, and he, I think, I think he isn't a textbook narcissist. So his capacity for feeling is is somewhat limited, but I do think he wanted to be the hero for those people. That was in his head, and I think he lived up to that, and I think they think he lived up to that. He stood up for them, he pushed for them, he fought for them, he promoted them, he guarded their interests, and it was a big moment for some of those groups who had felt downtrodden in Canada for some time, and I think they felt a great deal of relief and hope. So he did bring that to some people, and I think that's an important thing. And I think that the right in Canada learned from that and opened up a little bit to those groups themselves and stopped being as judgmental as they perhaps had been in the past. So I think that's all. That is an accomplishment that I would give to him.
Mm-hmm. All right. Lastly, we're into a leadership race now. I assume the goal is to have a new leader in place by the time Parliament comes back. Otherwise, what is the point of all this? That would mean a very fast leadership race. But looking at some of the names that have come up, there's been the Mark Carneys, the Chrystia Freelands, some people who are in cabinet, Dominic LeBlanc, and then you look at some outsiders. There's been, Christy Clark's name has come up, even a former BC premier. Is there anyone whose name has come up in the field of potential replacements who you feel would give them even a shot in the next election, or at least showing better than Trudeau would fare against Pierre Poilievre? Or is it just basically a done deal at this point, that you don't think that there's anyone out there? David?
Well, I do think if Mark Carney had been running Canada for the last 10 years instead of Justin Trudeau under the Liberal banner, we'd be way better off. But that said, he became a key Trudeau advisor. Mm-hmm. And he also, he's been outside of Canada so long. He's got that Michael Ignatieff out of touch flavor. Plus, he's so hooked in with green industry that made billions and billions of dollars. And there's all kinds of allegations against a lot of that money that went to green companies. So I don't think he's got a chance, even if he had some political skill, which is yet to be seen. But Christy Clark, I think, is more of an outsider. She would have to vow to get rid of the carbon tax, but politicians do those things all the time. They turn on a dime. So I think Christy Clark might appeal to mainstream Canadians. And the bar is very high for the Conservative Party right now, because not only do they have to get the most seats, they've got to get a majority. Because I think the Liberals and the NDP will be quick to go to another alliance. So if the Conservatives don't get a majority, we could have Christy Clark as leading a minority government. And I think because she's not she's outside of the Trudeau fold. The only thing tarring her is a carbon tax. She could have a shot at it, I think.
Lorne, what about for you? Like, are you looking at the field and thinking, oh, there's someone out there that actually might prove to be a strong challenge to Pierre Poilievre?
No, I think the next Liberal leader will be Kim Campbell. Will be like Kim Campbell. I mean, Kim Campbell replaced a very unpopular Brian Mulroney and took her party down to 2 seats because people were interested not in who replaced Mulroney, but in punishing the party that had foisted Mulroney on them for as long as they did. And I think that there's going to be the same desire to punish the Liberals for having kept Justin Trudeau in there as long as they did. I mean, take a look at the U.S. election in November. You had Kamala Harris come in, who was new, but people had already made up their minds that they were going to punish the Democrats for Bidenomics. And when you look at the U.S. economy versus ours, their economy is much better than ours is. But people were still mad at the things that David had enumerated earlier, inflation, largely the cost of living and unemployment. And their numbers are much better in both of those categories than Canada. So I think there are going to be an awful lot of people who just want to vote the Liberals out. And the other thing is you got Chrystia Freeland, who in the most recent polling, Angus Reid Institute had a poll out last week that showed she would fare better than any of the other candidates who have already declared or been rumored. But people keep saying all the time, even after she resigned, well, she was Trudeau's closest friend in the cabinet, his closest advisor. She was his most loyal deputy, et cetera, et cetera. She gets dinged with all this stuff. Like maybe she stood up to him on deficit spending at the very end and the GST holiday. But she was in tight with Trudeau on every other policy all the way through their time together in cabinet. And, the only two people whose names have been mentioned so far who don't get that tarring are Mark Carney, and David's point is absolutely bang on. We do not know his political skills yet. So far, he has just been fill in the blank. And everybody gets to fill in the blank for Mark Carney according to how they hope a Liberal leader would function. But as soon as he starts to have to campaign, he becomes who he is and not who we hope he is. And that's hard for a candidate to survive if he hasn't got political skills. And I don't think Mark Carney has great political skills. And then Christy Clark, who always fought the sort of dim bulb stereotype in BC, and who left office a very unpopular premier in British Columbia. So, yes, could one of them do better than Trudeau? Could Francois Philippe Champagne do better? Fine. I don't think we're going to see a francophone elected, because the Liberals typically alternate between francophones and anglophones. And one of the other ones, so the New York Times started pumping up Melanie Joly about a month ago. Melanie Joly Warren Kinsella keeps calling her the worst minister in Canadian history. She's terrible. But again, it's a blank slate, and you can then project onto a blank slate any quality you want to see in a leader until they start to campaign. And so I don't think this is going to be a very quick campaign. The talk yesterday at a Liberal circle was that they wanted a leader selected by March the 15th so that person could go into Parliament on the 25th of March when it resumes as the new Prime Minister. And so it's going to be hard and fast and bashing and banging, and I don't see anybody surviving it unscathed.
Yeah. It will be interesting to see how the leadership race unfolds if we have a new Liberal leader and Prime Minister by the time Parliament comes back. As I say, I assume that's going to happen, because otherwise, what's the point of all this? Because then the opposition could just turn around and have a non-confidence motion, and then we go to an election and they don't have a leader in place. And what do you see from there? But ultimately, it's going to be a wild and woolly few months in Canadian politics. All culminating, I assume, in the G7 in Kananaskis in June, with potentially a new prime minister regardless, but potentially a whole different party in charge. Lorne, David, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Dave.
You bet.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guests, David Staples and Lorne Gunter. More from them at edmontonjournal.com and edmontonsun.com. I'm Dave Breckenridge. Thanks for listening.